I didn't go to that gala to impress anyone. I went because it was part of the job, nothing more. It was Saturday evening, October 14th, 2023, a little after 7:30 p.m., when I stepped into the hotel ballroom in downtown Chicago, the kind of place where the lights are soft, the smiles are rehearsed, and everyone seems to know exactly where they rank. I remember adjusting my jacket, checking my phone once, then slipping it into my purse, telling myself to relax. This was work, just work. I had been a project manager at the firm for years by then, dependable, quiet, easy to overlook. The kind of employee people trust but rarely talk about, and that suited me just fine. I didn't need attention. I never had. My father used to say that real security doesn't announce itself, and he lived by that until the day he passed. He built everything slowly, property by property, teaching me to keep my head down and my name off plaques. After he died, I inherited the portfolio and the responsibility that came with it, and I learned quickly that wealth changes how people look at you, how they listen, how they decide what you deserve. So I kept it to myself. At work, no one knew anything beyond my title and my salary range. They didn't know why I drove an older car or why I never talked about vacations or neighborhoods. They just knew I showed up, did my job, and didn't make waves. The company culture made that easy. There was a clear order to things even if no one ever said it out loud. Executives at the center, managers orbiting close enough to feel important, and people like me somewhere on the edge. Useful, but interchangeable. You could feel it in the conversations, in the way certain people were greeted by name while others were nodded at and forgotten. As I stood there holding a glass of sparkling water, listening to laughter bounce off crystal and linen, I felt that familiar sense of being slightly out of place, like I'd wandered into a room that wasn't built for me. I brushed it off the way I always did. I reminded myself why I was there, reminded myself that I belonged just as much as anyone else. I had no idea that in that exact moment, long before a single word was said to me, that room had already made up its mind. I didn't know it yet, but that night was already deciding who I was allowed to be. By the way, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future stories like this. It couldn't have been more ordinary at first, just the usual mingling, name tags, the soft clink of glasses, until around 8:05 p.m. when Richard appeared beside me with his wife Jennifer and introduced us like it was a formality he could check off before moving on. Jennifer looked me up and down the way some people do when they think they're being subtle. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that stays on the surface, and said, "Oh, so you're Maya, project manager, right?" Before letting the title hang in the air like it explained everything about me. I said, "Yes, I run delivery for a few of our key accounts," and held my tone steady, but she tilted her head toward my dress and added, lightly, as if she were giving friendly advice, "That's cute. Very practical. I always forget how stressful it must be to shop when you're on a corporate budget." And she gave a small laugh that made two nearby people glance over and then look away. Richard didn't correct her, didn't even notice the temperature shift, just took a sip of his drink and started talking to someone over my shoulder, while Jennifer continued, still smiling, "These galas can be a lot, you know. But it's good the company invites everyone. It keeps morale up, as if my presence were a charity in itself." I felt the sting hit first in my chest and then in my throat, a familiar warning that I could either react and give her exactly what she wanted, or stay calm and let her words expose her. So I simply nodded and said, "I'm happy to support the cause," even as my mind quietly filed away every syllable. When someone insults you with a smile, do you swallow it? Or remember it? Jennifer didn't let it drop, and by about 8:20 p.m., after another sip of wine and a quick scan of the room, she leaned closer like she was sharing a harmless secret and said, "Look, I'm not trying to be rude, but events like this are different." Then smiled again and added, "It's usually executives, partners, donors, people who are used to this. and when I didn't flinch, she shrugged and went a step further. People like you don't always realize how you come across in rooms like this, as if she were doing me a favor by putting me in my place. I kept my voice even and said, "I'm here because the firm invited me." And she let out a soft laugh and replied, "Right, and that's generous of them." Then glanced at Richard like he'd back her up and asked, "Babe, don't you usually keep these tables for leadership and clients?" Richard's jaw tightened for a second, and I saw him register the tone, but he didn't step in. Instead, he gave a quiet, dismissive half smile and said, "Jen, it's fine." In the same way people say it's fine when they mean they don't want a scene, and that silence told me everything about where he thought I belonged. Jennifer took his non-response as permission and continued, louder this time because the music had shifted and more people were drifting our way. "I just hate seeing company resources wasted," she said, waving her hand at the room, "because these tickets aren't cheap, and honestly, if you're not bringing in business, it's hard to justify." Then she looked straight at me and said, "No offense, but middle management doesn't usually move the needle." I felt the heat rise in my face, not because her logic made sense, but because I understood the point wasn't logic at all. It was dominance, the old American currency of making someone feel small in front of witnesses while keeping your tone polite enough to deny it later. And I realized she wasn't tipsy confused, she was precise. I nodded once, held her gaze, and said, "Thank you for the feedback," and her smile sharpened like she'd won something because she thought I'd accepted her label. And that's when I remembered something Jennifer didn't know. And Richard never bothered to ask. By 8:30 p.m., I had stepped a few feet away from them, just enough to breathe, and I could feel my heartbeat settling into that calm I'd learned to find when people tried to corner me with status and shame. Because the truth was, I'd been living with a secret so ordinary in my world that I rarely even thought about it. The building my company worked in wasn't owned by some faceless landlord. It was mine, held under a quiet LLC my father's attorneys had set up years ago for liability and privacy, the way most commercial owners do it in the U.S. to keep personal names off public-facing paperwork and to separate risk from assets. When Dad passed, the portfolio came to me with binders of leases, insurance policies, and operating accounts already in place, and I kept everything structured the same way he did. An LLC as the owner of record, a property management firm as the day-to-day contact, a registered agent for service, and my personal life kept completely separate. Because my father used to tell me, "If you want to sleep at night, keep your name off the front door," and I listened. That decision wasn't about playing games. It was about safety, leverage, and not turning money into my personality. And it's also why I never mentioned it at work, not even once. Even when the firm moved into that office space, and I sat in meetings where Richard complained about the landlord and joked about rent like it was some mystery villain draining our budget. I'd heard him say things like, "We've got to squeeze them on the renewal, and I'm not paying top dollar for a view of the parking garage." And I'd watched him pound the table in conference rooms while I kept my face neutral, because I never wanted my personal finances to become a conversation at my job. And I never wanted coworkers looking at me differently, asking favors, treating me like a wallet instead of a person. I could have corrected him 100 times, could have said, "Actually, I'm the owner," could have ended the whole dynamic with one sentence, but I chose quiet competence instead, because I believed respect earned through work meant more than respect forced through power. Standing there in that ballroom, listening to Jennifer's voice still carrying behind me, I understood that I hadn't walked into a misunderstanding. I'd walked into a test of social class, and they were both comfortable administering it because they thought there was no cost. I didn't plan revenge, but I also wasn't going to shrink. A little before 8:45 p.m., the music dipped, and the MC's voice came through the speakers with that polished charity event cadence people in the U.S. recognize instantly, and the room started drifting back toward their tables as servers moved in with dinner plates and wine refills like they'd rehearsed it. The host said, "Good evening, everyone. If we can have your attention for just a moment." then thanked sponsors, read off a few corporate names, and paused long enough for applause to roll through the ballroom in neat little waves, the kind that sound supportive without being too enthusiastic. Then she shifted to the segment everyone cared about, the recognition part, and she said, "Tonight, we're also honoring a donor whose contribution helped fund this year's scholarship program." And I felt my shoulders tighten because I knew exactly which donation she meant. The one my property team had arranged weeks earlier, the one I'd approved without attaching my personal name to it. She continued, "This donor is also a longtime supporter of local education initiatives, and in addition, the owner of the building that houses one of our event partners." And I heard a few heads turn because suddenly it sounded like power, like proximity to something important. I watched Richard straighten in his seat at the edge of the nearby table, the way people do when they expect a name they recognize, and I saw Jennifer glance around with that same hungry curiosity that had been all over her face earlier, as if she were about to collect another social win. The host smiled and said clearly, "Please join me in welcoming Ms. Maya." And when she said my last name, the sound in the room didn't swell. It dropped, because people weren't sure if they'd heard right, and confusion is always quiet at first. For a beat, no one clapped, just a few scattered taps that died out quickly, and I could feel Jennifer's eyes on me before I even turned, wide and fixed like her brain was trying to force the room back into the story she'd already written. Richard's face drained so fast it looked unreal under the ballroom lights, and he kept staring at the stage, then at me, then back at the stage, like he was waiting for someone to correct the mistake and rescue him. I stood up slowly, not because I wanted to make a point, but because I refused to look rushed or rattled, and I picked up my clutch with steady hands as if this were any other moment on any other night. As I stepped into the aisle, I heard the host add, "She's the principal behind a commercial real estate group with properties across the region." And that's when the applause finally caught up. Not warm at first, but automatic, because people clap when they realize they might have underestimated someone important. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. Power doesn't need to speak loudly. By the time I reached the stage, it was around 8:48 p.m., and the applause had settled into something smoother, not because people suddenly cared about me, but because they cared about what my name represented, and that difference was hard to miss once you've lived long enough to recognize it. The host leaned in and said quietly, "Thank you for being here," then handed me the microphone and turned back to the crowd with an easy smile, adding, "Maya's family has been investing in commercial property in Chicago for years, and her firm continues that work today." And I could feel the room recalibrating, strangers sitting a little straighter, eyes tracking me with fresh interest. I kept my shoulders relaxed and said, "Good evening," then paused just long enough for the room to settle, and I made sure my voice stayed warm, not sharp, because I wasn't there to punish anyone. I was there to support a scholarship fund and to keep my dignity intact. "I'm honored to contribute," I said, "and I'm grateful to be in a room full of people who care about giving students a real chance. And I thank the organizers by name, the way my father taught me to, direct, sincere, and brief, because nothing rattles insecure people more than someone who doesn't need to prove a point." The host nodded and added, "Her donation this year helped expand the program, and her portfolio includes several properties in the Loop and surrounding business districts." And the applause came again, louder this time, the kind that feels less like celebration and more like recognition, and I could almost hear people mentally adjusting their earlier assumptions. As I stepped back from the microphone, I let my eyes move across the nearest tables without searching for anyone, but I still caught Richard staring at me with a tight, stunned expression, and beside him, Jennifer sat perfectly still, her smile gone, her posture locked, as if her body didn't know what to do with the new reality. I didn't point at her, I didn't even hold her gaze for long, because humiliation doesn't require theatrics when the room has already done the work for you, and the most powerful move is often the quietest one. On my way down, I allowed myself one small glance in their direction and gave Jennifer a calm, polite smile, the same kind of social smile she'd used on me earlier. Only mine didn't hide a blade. It carried a message. I smiled at Jennifer, not to hurt her, but to show her I saw her. Monday morning came too quickly, the kind of morning that hits with the heaviness of a long weekend fading into something uncomfortable. The moment I walked into the office, I could feel it, the tension in the air, like the building had suddenly been filled with a quieter hum, the kind that you can't quite place but know is there. The usual greetings were offbeat, too fast or too slow, as if people were figuring out how to act around me after Friday night's reveal. I passed by a couple of colleagues, and one of them, I swear, couldn't hold eye contact for more than a second. The whispers followed me down the hall like a trail, the ones that stop the second you turn your head. At my desk, the space felt unusually still, and I sat down without looking at anyone. By 9:30 a.m., I could see Richard across the floor pretending to be absorbed in his phone, but his movements were too sharp, like he was dodging something, someone, like he was avoiding me. He didn't approach, didn't say a word, and when he glanced up from his screen, he looked away before I even had the chance to greet him. I wondered for a moment if he was waiting for something from me, or if he was still processing what happened. As the morning dragged on, I realized something. The revenge, the moment of exposure, didn't feel like a victory. It wasn't explosive, not dramatic. It was final. It was like the kind of justice you don't need to shout about, the kind that settles in your bones and settles everything around it. But as I sat there, watching him keep his distance, a part of me started to wonder if the real play was still ahead, because I thought it was over. I was wrong. By Tuesday afternoon, I was ready for the day to end. I sat at my desk, my fingers tapping absently against my keyboard, when Richard appeared in the doorway of my office. He stood there for a second, his hands fidgeting by his sides, and then, in a voice that cracked before he even spoke, he said, "Maya, can we talk? Private." I didn't even try to hide my surprise. He'd avoided me all morning, and now he was standing in front of me asking for a conversation. I nodded, motioning for him to sit down. He closed the door behind him, but there was no hesitation in his steps now, just the air of a man about to confess something he couldn't hold any longer. He sat down, folded his hands, then looked up, his eyes red, the way they get when someone is holding back tears for too long. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who you were, not really, and I'm ashamed. What I said, how I treated you, it's not who I am. I was scared. I'm not proud of it." The words tumbled out in a rush, and for a moment it felt like I wasn't sitting across from the boss who had ignored every effort I'd made to speak up for myself. Instead, I was looking at a man who had finally seen the weight of his own arrogance, and it was more than he could carry. He wiped his face with his sleeve, his eyes brimming. "I was afraid of you, Maya," he admitted, his voice small now, afraid of losing control, of being outclassed. "I've spent my life making sure no one saw me as weak." I just watched him, giving him the space to finish. "I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know it's not going to happen again. Please, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'm asking for another chance, not just with you, but with the company." There was a long silence, the kind where everything is laid bare, and I realized then that I wasn't looking at someone trying to escape punishment. I was looking at someone trying to reconcile with his own reflection. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch a little longer before I spoke. "I'm not firing you, Richard," I said, my tone steady but not unkind. "I'm not threatening you, and I'm not going to expose this any further. But I expect you to do better, for yourself, for the team, and for the people you lead." His shoulders slumped with relief, but I didn't feel the rush of triumph that maybe I should have. It wasn't about the fall, it was about the clarity that comes when someone sees themselves for who they really are. I realized then that revenge isn't about destruction, it's about clarity. By the following week, the air had shifted. I set boundaries quietly but firmly, making it clear that respect, not familiarity, would be the foundation of every interaction moving forward. I could feel the change even in the smallest exchanges, the way people asked for my input, the way they approached me in meetings. There was an unspoken understanding now, one that didn't need to be reinforced with grand gestures. Jennifer never again made the same mistake. She would nod politely when we passed each other in the hallway, smile in meetings, but her eyes always held a trace of something I couldn't place. Maybe a mix of guilt, maybe fear, but certainly nothing like the condescension from before. I could tell she resented the silence between us, the distance I'd created, but there was nothing she could do to close it. She lost the right to be more than polite. But she never crossed the line again. Richard, on the other hand, took his lessons more seriously. He stayed out of my way, but he also learned to respect my space, to acknowledge my work, without trying to downplay my contributions. It was as if he realized finally that I didn't need his validation, that I was already operating in a world of my own making. The office became quieter in a way I hadn't anticipated. No more awkward jokes or dismissive comments, just the sound of people doing their jobs, including Richard and Jennifer, who now kept their distance, not because I demanded it, but because they had come to understand that my presence, my success, wasn't something to be diminished. Justice had been served, not through the destruction of their careers, but through the simple, quiet reclamation of my own worth. It felt satisfying, not because I'd won, but because I hadn't needed to lose anything to do it. Power had settled in a different place now, not with the loudest voice, but with the calm strength of someone who understood exactly who they were. I didn't need to ruin them, I realized. They already understood. By the time everything settled, I realized the lesson I had learned was bigger than any personal vendetta. Power doesn't come from loud declarations or proving others wrong. It comes from quiet resilience, from knowing exactly what you're capable of and not feeling the need to justify it. I'd spent years hiding my strength, thinking it would protect me from the kind of treatment people like Jennifer and Richard dished out. But I didn't need to hide anymore. The truth is, the world doesn't expect you to stay silent forever. People who are used to underestimating you, to controlling the narrative, they don't understand that real power isn't about domination. It's about the courage to stay true to yourself without needing anyone's permission. I had learned that the hard way, and I wasn't about to give it up. That night, when the world thought they had me figured out, when they believed they could define who I was and where I stood, I showed them something different, something they never saw coming. And I didn't do it with grand gestures or vindictive moves. I did it with restraint, with confidence, and most importantly, with grace. Sometimes the people who look down on you don't learn their lesson until the ground beneath them belongs to you. So if you're watching this and you're someone who's been underestimated, who's been pushed aside, let me tell you this: your quiet strength will be your loudest statement. Don't ever feel the need to explain it to anyone. They'll see it when the time comes. Leave a comment below if you've ever felt underestimated. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power. You never know when your moment will come.